Another Saturday here at Mutant Worlds with some change of looks. And a surprise so as much to us as it is to you, probably, because we had a last moment cancellation because of health reasons, and we wanted to put the New Mutants show 2 weeks from now. That's for the people that wanted to show that 2 weeks from now. And today we're doing the animated series, which probably a lot of people watching us about X-Men know about. That was my introduction, and probably of some other people here. So today we have Sandy Jimenez with us right here. And as for the usuals, Gabriel, Travis, and me, I'm Duna, and I'm the host. And well, let's roll it.
This week on Mutant Watch.
So while we start, thank you to all of you for coming today and for joining on this surprise show. And well, the first thing I wanna to start a little bit chatting, and this just go like as informal as we can go. What stuff like struck you the most, or did you like the most, or storyline, characters, whatever the animated series that pretty soon enough is gonna be like 30 years since it launched on TV. So that's great.
92.
And yeah. So who wants to start talking about their nostalgic moments?
I mean, I can speak to it since I think out of all of us here, I was probably the only one who was like really awake and sentient and old enough to sort of watch it because it was 92 and I'm 53. So, it was a really anticipated show because I don't know how much of the background you guys know about it or how many the sort of audience watching it right now knows, but initially there was a pilot called X-Men Pryde, I think Pryde of X-Men, and it was a play on Kitty Pryde's name. For those of us, I was actually in college at the time when it broke, and there was a lot of noise about it because it had been a pilot that had been developed very much at the last minute. It was a sort of like a couple of episodes of RoboCop that had to be produced. If you can imagine, this was the 80s. There was a Saturday morning RoboCop show, like the most violent movies you could ever imagine. They repackaged for children. So instead of doing a 13th or 14th episode of the last season, I think it was the Marvel managed to get that money put into this pilot. And that floated around for a couple of years, and everybody thought that was kind of going to be it. And in 92, as part of this sort of children's block, TV was so different than it is today. You had specific hours when children's programming was supposed to be on. And that was Saturday mornings and afternoons. And that was what was called it had to be safe harbor for content. So that that X-Men came along the way it did with all the socio-political issues. One of the things that always hamstrung all of these superhero shows was that, Marvel and even DC by that point had already launched Vertigo. We're doing such adult things, but anytime you saw a brand extension, it didn't match the source material either at all in content, or they made it so soft. And you kind of can't do that with X-Men. I mean, X-Men has such allegory in it. So that for me and guys of my generation who were trying to sort of enter the comics industry at that time, what was so amazing about that show was how true to form that they actually picked up storylines. Characters looked like the characters in the comic. They very much, if you were familiar with Jim Lee's work at that time, they were kind of making it look like that. That was also new. They didn't do this sort of like Super Friends take on it. So.
So for me, I was like junior high at the time, and I was at St. Catherine's Indian School, and we didn't get it at the school, at the dorms. So people would come from home and had seen it. And like I had a weird relationship with TV because I grew up on the res mostly, and you can't get cable on the res because they're not going to run the physical cable there. And so before satellite kind of became easier to get, you just didn't get TV, but you had VHS. Everybody had VHS player. You rent a VHS player and trade tapes. And so when an X-Men cartoon came out, I had seen the Pryde of the X-Men, and the cartoon came out, and people would come to school and talk about it. And so all we knew, if you didn't have TV, all you knew was what people were saying about it, and it was all about Morph. And so, like, if you were into comics, like I was into comics already, and I was like, who the hell is Morph? And that was like this big. So when I think about that cartoon, the things that most stick out to me are being told things that didn't match the comics at all. And I was like, I watch it now, and I'm like, it's pretty close. And especially in the sentiment and the politics, it was really pushing things. But being told it by other kids, it was like, this is nothing like the comics. This is a travesty. I was very, young nerd offended by the cartoon at the time.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of that game of telephone going on back in those days because the internet was not what it is today. I mean, there was some BBS boards, but I mean, 92. I mean, I can't express to people how early in sort of organized fandom that was. People still did things by letters, or they argued amongst themselves, as you were doing.
So my introduction to the animated series, I might have watched it when it first came out. I was 4, so my memories are a bit hazy. But once I started getting into comics, it kind of was around the same time that I really started to get into the show. But I also don't think my brain really comprehended that it was based off a comic book. It was like, ooh, shiny superheroes. So my memories about when I first watched it were a bit hazy, but it's something that I've rewatched a couple of times. Most recently, I started watching the animated series a little bit it was at the beginning of quarantine or the beginning of the year. I don't know. COVID quarantine makes time fly strangely. But relatively recently, I started to rewatch it, and it holds up surprisingly well. Yeah, there's some lines that are a little bit cornier now than when they first aired, but the concepts, the plot, everything, it holds up really well. And that really stuck out to me in my limited rewatch.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to explain to people the impact of something like, when they did the Time Fugitives episodes, which were done in 2 or 3 parts. That was such an obvious allegory for AIDS at the time, which was still very much raging in this country and in the world without any, real medical or pharmaceutical response on the horizon. And the fact that, again, that they were they were kind of smuggling this into Saturday morning television. This is before it was in syndication. So it's like Saturday morning television was really considered off limits. Like that's where the stuff really had to be clean, really had to be safe. Those were hours that were basically here in the United States, again, speaking specifically from the US or US-Canada perspective, the government, insists that there be certain amount of hours for programming. That's, of course, now become irrelevant and now doesn't exist because, Cartoon Network and there's so much children's programming. But right there, that shows you the conundrum because they're taking on probably what was one of the more mature, not in the sense of explicitness, but in terms of the political allegory in it. They're taking a property like X-Men and going, well, kids like this and are reading this, so we should put it on television. And somehow, I mean, they did it with, at the time, minimal interference because I think not many people were watching, I mean, on the corporate side, not the audiences.
So before I tell my tale, I was 2 when this started, so I also didn't watch this as a kid. Before I tell my tale, I wanna shout out to the comments because we have already some of them, which is really nice. And one was Armando Batista shouting out Sandy Jimenez. So That's a
Like
friend of you
Hondo.
that was like, yeah, that's great. And also B Rat, which is a reviewer for us for Comic Watch. So it was like something like the Pride of the X-Men stuff, like that was a nice catch up. And also Asta had a comment talking about that what she really remembers is X-Men Evolution, which was more 90s, and we can talk about that one some other day or at the end, maybe we'll get that. And she thought that Carl's name was Gurt, short for yogurt. So that's nice. And well, my story is it was re-releasing on TV when I was a child, when I was like 10 or something like that. And I watched a lot of cartoons. I remember I watched a lot of Pokemon and Digimon, and I watched a lot of Ghost Yoko, and I don't remember the others, but I remember that the X-Men one was the one that really struck me, and probably because some of the things that they were talking about were like, I don't know, like mind opening for me. That was what was made me want to read the comics, really. And I'm really glad that I got that by accident, because that was like a re-release in television, probably at Saturday morning too. So I had a pretty close experience to the true one, and and I don't know, I feel like what Sandy said, that some of the themes that were brought up were like, at least for this type of cartoons, really, really like risky in some places, but also they kind of get away with it because the tone and the aesthetics and etc. is so campy that you really can, like, a lot of the time there's sudden things and fighting and all that stuff, so you can kind of get that. I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but and that, I think that's what drove me to it, because I was very interested from very early into like stuff that talk about things in the world. That's something that has always been a point for me. So I think that's my experience. I got a similar experience, but pretty much later. And it's my favorite. I like X-Men Evolution and the others, but this is still my favorite. Maybe because I also have some care for it, because as Sandy and other people point out, it adapted the Claremont era pretty closely, a lot of times, pretty clearly. And that really makes me nostalgic for it. So I want to turn around a little bit and ask you all, what character struck to you all most? What character? Because I want to know about this, because I have been rewatching some episodes in the last 24 hours, and and I was like, some of them really, really struck me heavily, but I want to know you all first.
One thing which is a little bit maybe the actual opposite of what your question is, but what struck me on my rewatch was how it was not the Wolverine show. There are whole episodes where he's not even in it. And like, if you know the X-Men from today's era, or even the other cartoons, one of which was literally called Wolverine and the X-Men, it seems almost unheard of, particularly with how the movies turned out. It's the Wolverine show. But watching the animated series, that's not at all the fact. It is much more of an ensemble show. And even the very first episode, the fact that the first people you see fighting and the very first people you see just kicking ass is Rogue and Storm. And that's how they open on the action on the show, is two women, powerful women, demolishing these robots. And that's a theme that's a trend I see that followed through on the episodes I rewatched, that there's no one that's really lesser, except maybe Jubilee, but she's supposed to be your like entrance character. But the actual X-Men, they're all formidable people.
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent point, Gabriel, because you know, that's been for those of us who grew up with these comic books, Gabriel. It's like that ascendancy of Wolverine has always been somewhat problematic, because if you grew up with these things, it's like he was like the James Dean character who was be a bit of an outsider. How much of an outsider is he if he's suddenly like the center of all the attention? And they managed to capture that in that animated series very well. You know, really, when Frank Miller ends up doing that 4-issue miniseries, that's when we have this like, you know, superstardom of Wolverine. You know, he's been popular, but when those 4 issues came out, it's like he started being crowbarred and shoved into every storyline made more central, and it kind of made you pine for the Dave Cockrum, Claremont, Byrne, you know, even Paul Smith years, when there seemed to be some sort of logic to the ensemble, right? It's like, yeah, it should be like Phoenix and Storm up front because their powers and abilities are off the charts, like, you know. And then that show kind of didn't. They didn't try to sort of correct that from some sort of audience appeal or marketing perspective. They really did rely on the actual text of the stories. We've just been joined by somebody.
Hello. Sorry I'm late. I had a very important engagement with our little niece, and she's 2 and super cute and cannot be denied. So apologies for being late, but I'm here to talk about X-Men cartoons and Gabriel's amazing hair.
Yeah, you didn't see my reaction. So if anyone wants to talk on any other character, I can go with the 2 things that I... So first of all, as Travis said a while ago, Morph is pretty central in the cartoons, and in a really, really great way. I don't know. Maybe it's because I have been rewatching some of it also in quarantine, and that's some of the things that struck me most is that Morph really goes through a like process of getting over some trauma and insecurity and fears and some stuff that really, really happened to him. Like they really let him go. And it's a really, really interesting character that wasn't that much in the comics, and it really strikes if you like the what they did with this character. And also, I just happen to have seen only 3 episodes in this 24 hours, and all of them had this extremely like close relationship between Xavier and Magneto that is like beyond, like they're very clearly ex-husbands. I can't read that other way. And I was like, I just got the best 3 episodes for this. I don't remember which episodes, but there were 3 episodes that it was very clear that they have this shared long history that is very Claremont, that is very true to Claremont. But also, since it's not there in any way, like it's not shown explicitly on the screen, is like made even bigger. And I like that a lot. It's like a really, really strong relationship, like really, really close. And I don't know how I turned this into fanfic about Xavier and Magneto, but someone else can go with their favorite characters too.
I think the show really did, like whoever was the showrunner at the time, they were really shipping Magneto and Xavier. There's a lot of like passion and energy every time, even when other characters are dealing with their dynamic. It's like we can't really be too hard on Magneto sometimes because we will offend Charles. And so that I think is true to the comics and maybe bigger than it was in the comics.
There's a moment when someone asks Magneto, "Do you love Xavier?" And Magneto is like, "Why are you asking me that? Like, how dare you ask me that question?" It's like, wow, that was intense, dude. So yeah.
If I may, you touched on Morph, and that was always something that stuck out to me. Is like you were saying, this is just basically a nobody character on page at this point for however long, right? And then here he comes, he's brought into the animated series, and he, more than almost anybody else, at least in the early couple seasons of the show, Morph has an arc, a narrative arc with a beginning, middle, and end. And it's, he clearly wasn't created for the animation show, but for all intents and purposes, he was recreated and repurposed to have that arc. And I mean, just as a little kid, obviously, I didn't understand that. But looking back on it, you can't say Wolverine has an arc. You can't say Gambit has an arc. But Morph does. And that is unique storytelling that you just weren't seeing in animation that much at that point. And I mean, it's very X-Men-esque, we think he's dead, and that was traumatic enough to 12-year-old Matt that somebody just died in the X-Men. But I really want to give props to whoever the writers were, and I should know this at this point in my life, but in showrunners, for having the daring not only to kill that character, but to give him a beginning, middle, and end of his story, and essentially create this character from nothing.
Yeah, I mean, citing that arc is an important thing in terms of speaking about the significance of the show as animation, because I think it's hard for a lot of people who've grown up with the current crop of animation we've had for the last 20 years to understand how early this was. Like, The Simpsons have only been around for a year at this point. Batman, the animated series, has only been around for half a season. And those are primetime shows. That's still not children's stuff. They're more in the sort of legacy of the Jetsons and the Flintstones, which appeared as, high satire, primetime, Sunday night shows. Batman, the animated series, had to appear on Sunday nights because it had actual gunfire in it.
Yeah.
That was one of, Bruce Timm's deal breakers. He was like, if I can't show people shooting each other, which sounds like a crazy thing to insist upon, for a lot of, reasons, however we feel about gun violence. But he felt that, it couldn't be, G.I. Joe, where people are shooting lasers and jumping out of, planes, and no one ever dies and there are no consequences.
Yeah.
So X-Men was one of the first Saturday morning cartoons that was a cartoon of consequence. That the episodes were progressive. Morph starts somewhere and he dies. Things happen. If you watch the show out of order, it starts to screw things up for you. And that was always one of the insistences on Saturday morning television for animation, that because of the way things are stripped in the media world, that it could go into syndication and run in any order, and no kid would be confused by it. And it was like, we as kids at the time, and again, I was already in my 20s, but even when I was a child, I would always say to myself, it's like, we get it, I understand. It's not going to blow my mind if I see an episode out of order. I'll just go back and watch them, Especially at that point where, as Travis was saying, you already had VHS, you already had sort of tape culture taking over, so people were already having that sort of viral relationship to it and could reconstruct the stories for themselves. But there was this real resistance, and even after X-Men did its 2 or 3 seasons, you still didn't have a show like that. If you look at the other Marvel offerings in the 90s that came after it and sort of coasted on its success, the Hulk show, which was decent, there was a Fantastic Four show that was done. Those shows do not have what that X-Men show had, which was, as you're saying, a clear direction, a clear arc. It's got, you've gone somewhere with those characters in 3 seasons.
Absolutely. And I mean, in that regard, the show itself is really mimicking and paying homage to the nature of comics themselves, where it's like, oh my God, I need to know what happens in the next issue, as they begin to become less singularly issued focused and more of an ongoing soap operatic narrative, which of course Claremont perfected in the 80s, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah,
he certainly leveraged it with more aggressiveness than anybody. I mean, he had subplots that went on for years.
Oh yeah,
legendarily infuriated editors. So I benefit, right?
Yeah, like you said, there was definitely a sense of continuation from episode to episode, with things building up, with mysteries. Like I said, I was 4 at the time, so I don't know how it originally aired. But during rewatching, the very first episode is a 2-parter, so I don't know if they both aired at the same time. But it ends in a cliffhanger, and then even that second part, it ends with that sense of consequence. Morph is dead, Beast is in jail, and almost every episode has that sense of there's more to come. Within like the first, like, I think 4 episodes, you get introduced to Cable as this weird, mysterious figure, and you get no answers at all when he first shows up. And then he'll pop up every like handful of episodes, and it has that kind of sense of this episode's part of a plot that's bigger, which, like you said, you didn't really get too much in Saturday morning cartoons. And when you did, there might only be like a handful of episodes that were those key episodes, but for the most part, it didn't really matter if you just jumped in.
Well, I mean, there's a huge difference too between what X-Men was doing with like the Genosha episodes. And you got to look at other cartoons around the same time or just before. And like, was it Transformers that had Carbamia was their Middle Eastern country?
That sounds very, very much like
this is how they were doing. Yeah, it was this very sort of, have an ethnic stereotype, solve it in 15 minutes out of the half-hour episode kind of thing. And that Genosha thing went on for a bit, and it was very serious. And that just wasn't, especially for Saturday morning, that's not, we were probably having the new Smurf adventures like in the next half hour. So that they really did take from the comics, I think, story-wise. A lot of the characters I still don't feel are my characters, I guess. Like Beast annoys me because their Beast is so serious and sullen and very ploddingly intellectual or whatever. And their Nightcrawler is so Catholic and only Catholic. But in terms of stories and in terms of the politics and the tone of those stories, they really carried that over. It was they trusted a child audience, which is impressive, especially now.
Well, that was the great existential question for those brand extensions at the time. It's like, are these for kids or aren't they? And I mean, as long ago as like 66, Esquire had written this article about how the average Marvel Comics reader was in college.
Mm-hmm.
So that battle has always been going on. And, I think, certainly when I was a kid in the 70s, there was always this thing when you'd hear any conversation about how these products were developed, that if you had something that continued, would that infuriate a young viewer, or would that in fact entice him to watch, if he or she to watch the next episode? And the question is, or ultimately the answer is, there's no one answer for anybody, especially today. I mean, the way we stream stuff, there are some people who give up on something after an episode. They have like zero attention span, and then there are some people who have to watch it that day, like end to end to end. But at the time, again, the X-Men was very much alone for whatever other issues fans may have had with it as an adaptation. As a piece of television, as a piece of animation, it was out there sort of forging new ground. Even the Batman animated series, which was far more cinematic and far more adult in nature, did not have these through points. The episodes were very much self-encapsulated. And you'd have sort of mini arcs that might go across the season or something like that.
And the occasional 2-parter.
Right. But not this kind of really story-driven, character-driven, this person has a need, or this conflict, or this political allegory is going on, and it's going to be resolved, in a nice way or in a bad way, but it's, you're building towards something. And I think that what happened in the late 90s with animation becoming more sophisticated really has its roots in that show, being done as well as it was.
I actually I watched some of the Batman animated series this last week, and I didn't watch a lot of it, but at the time either. But watching it now, there are episodes that I feel like they should continue. Like they didn't solve anything, they didn't wrap it up, but they'll have a joke at the end, and then it's done with. And it's like, yeah, just because Batgirl and Supergirl laughed doesn't mean that the problem is over. Just because, Batman said something funny to Commissioner Gordon doesn't mean, but that's how cartoons were at the time.
Yeah.
You had your time limit and they didn't want to carry over too much. And I realize now, like the X-Men series, they really did keep going. Threats were still out there. Most of the threats that come up are still out there by the end of that episode in some form.
Yeah, and I think there's a posture also with regards to, again, a shout out to whoever the showrunners were. I should know that too. I was definitely investigating this stuff at the time when it was new because it was so groundbreaking.
I can help.
It's not like there's not a magical device in front of all of us. Where we just type it in and get the
An
answer.
answer box of sorts.
Teach us, Luna. Teach us.
But it really is. It really is striking how they really trusted the X-Men. That show was asking the viewer to come into it, as opposed to sort of reaching outward, which is a very different posture. I mean, that's the posture of anything from like Twin Peaks to The Sopranos to anything else. They're not trying to seduce you. They're saying this is this interesting world. You come in and you buy into this, and we're not going to, give you the kind of rounded product that you're talking about with even something as groundbreaking as Batman the Animated Series, which was truly incredible. I mean, there are things to note. There are things about it as a Saturday morning cartoon that are infuriatingly typical, like the use of canned music. It's really The Simpsons and Batman the Animated Series that brought the orchestra back. And this, the music in X-Men Animated it's about as complex as what you'd hear in a Scooby-Doo cartoon. It's just like stuff on loops, and they got some really good musicians to put together some themes, and then they just chop them up and use them over and over again. But outside of that, again, for the time, it's pretty remarkable. I mean, guys of my generation remember the appearance of that show, and also another Saturday morning. I think it was part of sort of the Super Friends, like last seasons, where they actually, for the first time, they had Alan Burnett write the death of Bruce Wayne's parents. And you see this horrific act of gun violence on Saturday morning television. But that was one episode. It was like they came, and I think it's even half an episode. I actually don't think it's part of a two-parter that made up a half hour. And then until you see, Pryde of X-Men and X-Men proper, you don't have that level of confidence in the audience again until this show has its 3 seasons.
So, as for the creative part, there were a lot of people involved. We can't shout out all of them because there were a lot of people in. But there was Larry Houston was a producer and director for most of it. He's also a black man, so that's something that wasn't as usual in television. And the other important people were, I think, Eric and Julia Lewan, who were like the developers for most of it. And I think there's a lot of more people. But I feel like big part of why they brought up these themes is because people involved in creating these cartoons were affected by things, by oppression in different ways, and were like reflecting some of that. And I want to ask you all about some episode and some storyline. Sandy already brought up when they pretty much with the legacy virus went through an AIDS allegoric thing. But I want to ask you all if there's something that also strikes you as especially like pertinent, or that didn't really show up in Saturday morning cartoons, or do you think showed up less, more or less?
Well, I mean, if I can just say I that first story with Apocalypse and the so-called cure, Warren Worthington. Oh, look, everybody, I'm cured. My wings are gone. Hey, that was something really big to me. And of course, it's very central to X-Men in and of itself, of course, is this idea of loving you for who you are and being comfortable in your own skin. But that sort of theme isn't really something you saw on a Saturday morning cartoon at all. And of course, then he becomes Archangel and starts, flying around and zipping on those metal wings. But just thematically thinking back on it, that was really, really deep for a Saturday morning cartoon, especially of its era. Nobody.
I don't want to cut in again, but
Go ahead.
You know, I mean, again, the Holocaust stuff was really important, but I think like things like, you know, it's one of the first shows that didn't handle divorce in this sort of like Saturday afternoon special kind of way, and it wasn't just a backdrop to a character's, you know, sort of situation either. Like the parents, extended families were present. It was a very rounded show. So the way sort of things like, you know, being ostracized and like Angel's, you know, pain at his, what he ostensibly sees as a deformity, like you see how that plays out in his life and in other characters. And it's, again, it was a much richer way of transliterating what was happening in the comics, or had happened in the comics. And as you just said, for Saturday morning television, it was just, you know, we knew we were sort of in for something that was not going to be the things we had seen before. You know, there had been a horrible Fantastic Four adaptation done in the late 70s, but we didn't know that it was really going to be a revolution in terms of the actual content and the text, and this sort of, again, this new level of, it was sort of rewriting of the contract between a child and adolescent audience and the producers.
Go ahead.
Okay, I was gonna. It took me a bit to come up with one because memory is not what it used to be. But I think as far as like the concept, the theme of the episode, the one that sticks out to me the most is when Rogue ran away from the X-Men. And it dealt with such heavy emotions that was not something little Gabe was thinking of dealing with. And it was handled in what felt like a very respectful way. And was mostly about her having to deal with the cost of her own powers.
So, I mean, for me, again, the Genosha episodes were a heavy thing, but you still had, you know, South Africa apartheid was still an issue at that time. We were like a year, I mean, less than a year, really, because 91, 92, away from the Columbus anniversary, which was this big thing. You know, AIM was still big at the time. My family was very political. And so that Columbus stuff going on at the same time, and then suddenly there was this X-Men cartoon and people were talking about these things. It felt like there was a real zeitgeist there, that things, not necessarily that things were going to change, but that you had to make things change, and that this was the world we were living in. And so that still really hits me if I rewatch that part of the cartoon, those episodes.
Yeah, I also remember them satirizing television in a couple of plot lines, the stuff with Mojo.
Yeah.
I thought that was, I mean, it didn't, you know, because I was older at the time when I saw it, it wasn't some revelation, but I kept remembering thinking to myself, wow, like some 6-year-old kid's watching this. And this show that he's addicted to is telling him, you know, maybe watching this much TV isn't such a good idea.
Yeah.
It's radical. It's like kind of crazy. I mean, again, in the years since, The Simpsons have done that, you know, like every other episode. But for a show of this type, which is really not doing anything in quotes that metatextually, those are very striking things at the time. You know?
So I have mine clear, but first I want to read Asta's comment because it's about the same thing. And she said that the Morlock's storyline was pretty heavy. And well, like she said, the first introduction with the Morlocks was weird because it was an abduction with Angel theme. But like being exposed to a whole functional society living under the city because they don't fit in. And my story, the one that I feel like has struck me the most was the second time the Morlocks appear, which is, or the third time maybe, which is like Have Yourself a Morlock Little Christmas, which is a Christmas episode that is about poverty and class. like very clearly about it, and how marginalized people that also deal with with poverty have it much harder to assess things like healthcare, because they're not people that feed into the idea of these are people that we should help. So this is about a mutant that gets sick and he can't go to a hospital because he's a mutant, but he's poor, so he can get the medicines. And while the thread of the episodes kind of goes back to this like very classical Christianity, like give others things if you are like this thing that is not like as political as that. I feel like the idea that if you are marginalized is not the same if you are poor, like it really struck me. Like the first time I watched it, and every time I have watched it, I have seen like this episode as very clearly dealing with class, which is not something I feel cartoons do a lot. Most probably because they're within the world of television, and that world doesn't really deal with class that much. And I don't know, I like it a lot. And yeah, it's not the same if you are, for example, I'm trans. It's not the same being trans and being poor, and being trans and being rich, because you don't have the same access to healthcare, to the things that you need. And that is a like very heavy barrier. And I really like how it was shown in these episodes, where the X-Men had all these things that they're gonna make a dinner and etc. And suddenly one of the Morlocks was sick and he couldn't even go to a hospital. That was like heavy for me. So that's mine.
Yeah, I've always gotten the sense, I don't know how the episodes were developed, especially the ones you're talking about, Duna, but I have to believe they were brought in at the last moment before anybody could do anything. Because, I mean, this is still a time, and we're still sort of in this era, but, you know, the model of media, we didn't understand back then. Even I, as a young adult, didn't understand, like, we're not the client. The client is the advertisers.
Yeah.
We're part of what gets sold. Our eyeballs are what gets sold. So for them to have snuck in those issues and done entire stories about those themes at a time when basically the role of a children's show was to sell toys, plastic, gum, soda, you know, and maybe the latest like wackadoo toy that was going to put somebody's eye out, you know, to be smuggling all of this rich content and discourse in is, again, just really radical. I mean, today you can say with streaming that the audience is the client finally, because you know you pay for Netflix or you pay for HBO Max directly, and they reward you watching by putting more stuff up that you want. But at the time, you were kind of told you had a vote, that you were kind of supporting your show, but you weren't really. You were part of a demographic that was being caught by a big net. And you know that they again, for the time, for 1992, this show really was groundbreaking. It was really kind of every episode to episode, you were just kind of stunned by what they were doing and what wasn't happening everywhere else.
Well, and to build on something you were just saying, Sandy, like the 90s in general are kind of known as this golden age of animation, or second golden age of animation, I should clarify. And X-Men are absolutely part of that conversation for all the reasons that you just described.
Yeah, I mean, you know, technically it's very much of a piece, you know, you can see the sort of influence of the Korean studios in terms of how the stuff's built and made. And, you know, they're sort of cutting corners in ways that stylistically work. But it really is the writing and what they managed to do thematically. And again, just that stringing of storylines where they were just like, so they'll miss an episode or two.
Yeah.
They'll be with it, you know, they'll just catch it. And, you know, again, VCRs notwithstanding, I mean, that used to happen. You know, it's like you missed an episode or two, you're like, what? This character is now on Magneto's side? What just happened? You didn't know the comic books. For you know, some of the readers who this might have been their onboarding, like Gabriel, you know, this might have been mind-blowing at times. You know, and I think it was a very smart strategy looking back.
Oh, definitely. No, there was definite synergy happening there for the X-Men in general as a pop cultural property in the earliest of the 90s, because I mean, obviously X-Men #1 blew up huge. You've got toys everywhere. You've got this awesome new cartoon, and it all came together to create the X-Men as a pop cultural force that, I mean, almost 30 years later now, we are still evergreen and ever present.
Yeah, I mean, I always wondered how much of a positive feedback loop that was for kids going back and reading the comics at the time.
Yeah.
Because again, I don't remember as a child, cartoons didn't do that for me when I was younger. I kind of watched them to see the characters I liked move around and do stuff. Like, you didn't watch the Super Friends to get some new shade of understanding on what was happening in the Justice League. You kind of tolerated it because it's like, this is the only place I'm going to get to see Batman throw a punch. You know, but it wasn't, you know, these three seasons of, you know, the X-Men the animated series are great companions to the stories because they do something slightly different, and you know, they are necessarily a Saturday morning cartoons a different animal, but with the performances, with the depth of feeling, as you know, Travis mentioned and as Duna mentioned, you do get a different layer of understanding of mistakes in these stories.
Someone asked in the comments, Armando asked in the comments, how would we introduce this series to today's teenage viewer? And that's a big question.
So I may be weird for saying it this simply, but I say just start at the beginning.
You're not weird, because I was thinking that too.
Yeah.
Those opening 2 issues, yeah, it gives you a sense of all the characters. It gives you the sense of the stakes. It gives you a sense of the action. And it also gives you a sense of some of the things that might be viewed as a negative, like some of the corny dialogue, and which for us, or at least for me, as someone who watched it, is more of a nostalgic thing now. But for a new viewer, Rogue's iconic line of "more nervous than a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs" may seem a little bit off, but for us experienced viewers, it's something that, like, it gives us a chuckle. So it's something that works for us. But I think there's enough in those first 2 episodes that can overshadow that and hook a new viewer.
Definitely.
I mean, there's bad writing in animation today.
Yeah.
So, you know,
Absolutely.
Yeah. Take it with a grain of salt.
that was some guy in some studio's idea of what a Southern person should sound like.
But in the 90s, that line was hilarious to little kid Mike Gabe.
It's very Claremont-esque. That's exactly the type of dialogue he would write. Maybe not that line specifically, but it's in his ballpark.
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, I'm with Gabrielle. I wouldn't tell him anything. You know, I think it's a great way to onboard somebody who maybe doesn't know anything about X-Men, and if they do, again, I think it's a great companion to other experiences, you know, with that material for sure.
Yeah, just put it on, and if they get interested in it, they're interested in it. If they're not, they're going to drift off from it.
Yeah.
You can't help bad taste.
Well, and I mean, let's just say it has a lot of these characters in their most iconic looks. You know, Rogue with the green and yellow and the jacket. You know, that is Rogue to me. That look is to Rogue as, I don't know, Superman's classic look is to Superman. I mean, Wolverine has his classic look, and you've got Storm in the best non-Cockrum outfit ever, and she's had a lot of cool looks. So there's something elemental about the presentation of the characters. And I know I'm a little biased in that regard because that's the era I grew up in. But you know what? Cyclops visor, no cap, no skull cap.
Well, I mean, just thinking about what you were saying about dialogue and Claremont, there's a lot of Claremontisms that don't necessarily play today with certain readers, but they didn't play with certain readers at the time, right?
Yeah.
There's certain phrases that he overused, and if you're fine with them, you're fine with them. If you're into them, you know, that's great. So same thing with the cartoon. There's going to be lines that aren't going to hit, but they maybe didn't hit somebody at the time too.
Yeah.
So I think you can't worry about that.
Yeah.
I mean,
And I think
testimony to the lasting, greatness of that show. You guys used the music for this show.
Yeah.
What we opened with, right?
I mean, true story. When I was teaching little kids, I was mentoring little kids in theater, and we were playing music, and we thought we had this sick riff. We had this great song going, and it was the X-Men cartoon, because their other teacher on another day was playing that episodes for them. And so they just started to play it. So I started to play along with them. I was like, this is awesome. And later we played the recording for somebody. They're like, that's the theme song from X-Men.
I will tell you at the time, again, because I was, in my early 20s when I saw the show, the music seemed antiquated at the time in 92. It was so heavily synthesizer driven. It was like, wow, why are they? But it was that much more, had that much more of an impact. Because of that, because it didn't, all the other shows had, this really obnoxious sort of guitar-driven, whatever their idea of transliterating alt rock or whatever was happening at the time, But that show was just all straight. It was like Devo and Pink Floyd, like decided to do the opening to this show.
I find that very interesting that you said it kind of felt like almost like retro and outdated, but from my younger perspective, it was so new and it was so different because I wasn't around for what it was referencing in the past. So that's pretty interesting.
I think a lot of Saturday morning cartoon theme songs. Like, I have no idea what the Rambo theme song was, and I know I watched the Rambo cartoon. I don't know what that was. There were like a lot of cartoons that had these kind of either quick synth riffs or they were sing-along sort of things.
Yes.
And that X-Men opening, and even just those sort of static hero shots, you didn't see static hero shots like that looked intense at the time. You saw kind of very friendly, the hero is flexing for us or whatever.
Yeah, G.I. Joe and Cobra are rushing towards each other dramatically, right.
And so those big kind of icon shots with that music, it really did feel like a different world.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Travis, because like every other show, like G.I. Joe, whatever, like they literally sing you all the guys' names.
Yeah.
Oh, and like this is, Scarlet whatever, and she does this, and like they're all sort of like calling, like sounding off, to like train the child viewer into memorizing what's going on.
Yeah.
Must buy shipwreck toy. But there were other elements to that opening sequence that are just so perfect. The display of the power in front of the name, like you were talking about, Travis, like that was ripped off by several other cartoons to much less varying degrees of success. I mean, because it was just instantly iconic. It's like, here's Wolverine's logo, here's Wolverine, and here's his claws. Bang, you know who he is. Go buy his toy.
Again, in the context of Saturday morning television, probably the only other notable I'm trying to rack my brain here, but Johnny Quest was another show that didn't have like la la la, here's Johnny Quest and such and such. They just showed you a truckload of action, just impossible situations, some stuff that you wouldn't even see in the episodes sometimes. But really X-Men and I guess Venture Brothers,
Robotech.
Years later, had this like heavily orchestrated, big operatic open.
Robotech in the 80s.
Yes.
But like Robotech wasn't, show aired everywhere in the States, and Johnny Quest got pulled off the air, like literally pulled off. And that's where we get these sort of Scooby-Doo type team shows, is because the networks were under trouble from the government over that and regulatory boards.
Yeah.
So don't push it too far or you get one season.
So,
interesting.
Yeah.
I want to take advantage that we talk about the music to say that our intro is played by Eric Calderone, which I don't give credits enough for. I'm gonna put his Twitter here in the chat, and and yeah, it's a heavy metal version, which is, I guess, the best way to play the song.
It's badass.
Yes.
Yes, super badass. And and for changing subjects, since you all have been talking a bit about the influence this series had after, I want to ask you all about first personal influence, especially to Sandy, because I know you, Sandy, have experience with directing and with storyboarding, and you kind of step into trying to do an adaptation of Marley Davidson, your comic, to animated. And I want to know if there's any inspirations from the animated series, and for the rest of you, if you're inspired by it to do anything creative. That's mine.
I mean, from a production standpoint, the show's legacy is that it was one of the, and someone out there listening who knows a little bit more about this than I do, but it was one of the first ones I noticed as I was trying to sort of get involved in production, is that, animation's done on what's called 1s, 2s, or 3s. And what that means is, the sort of accepted or consensus view of reality in motion pictures is that it's 24 frames progressive. So if you're doing it on the 1s, that describes the ratio. You're literally doing a drawing for every 24 seconds. If you're doing it on the 2s, you're going somewhere between 12 and 16. And that's a lot of what we see. On the 3s is what we see a lot of coming from the Pacific Rim studios. For whether it's Toei animation, whether it's something like Robotech, and it has that slight ghostly look. That's why G.I. Joe looked the way it looked. It looked more reminiscent of that stuff. X-Men kind of did whatever the hell they wanted. Like, if a sequence called for 1-to-1, they did that. And if they didn't, if they needed to, I guess maybe save money in that particular part of the episode, or it wasn't that critical to the action, they do it on the 3s. And that had not been done before. That was really sort of eye-popping, because it gives the show a very different feel. It's one of the sort of unstated reasons why, when you talk to most people who grew up with the show or who were influenced by it, they can't quite describe why the show feels and looks the way it does, but that's one of the reasons. It's literally like the equivalent of, a good musician changing time signatures in a song or something. So it's notable for that. The modeling in it, if you look at the actual rendering of those figures, it doesn't hold up today because we have so much computer help, with regard to software, if you're using Harmony, or Adobe Animate, or any of the sort of, high-end Harmony being sort of the industry standard by Toon Boom. There's so much help to smooth you out. If you look at something like, it's not going to hold up to something like Rick and Morty, which looks so super clean, and yet is not vectorized. It's true pose-to-pose animation. But that show, the amount of line work that's on those characters, if you look at the way they didn't, one of the real tests of a good transliteration from a comic book to an animation is just how much they abbreviate the costume. Like, what starts to disappear, what details, what bells and whistles. Look at Rogue's costume. It's pretty elaborate. Her hair alone is like Emmy-winning stuff from an animation perspective, that they didn't just say, oh, we'll just make her hair short, and just not deal with it. All of those things are intangibles or things that aren't really noticed by an audience. But I will tell you, as someone who tries to draw the stuff, your eyes go right to it. You're just like, oh my God, how did they do this in the modern era? That is not the Disney era where you had 400 uncredited people, working blindly, behind the scenes to make Snow White dance or whatever. So things like that, when you look at the action sequences, you look at a character like Bishop and how faithfully he is recreated, animated, versus what you saw Jim Lee, draw in the comics. It's remarkable, and that set a sort of benchmark that you couldn't use it as an excuse anymore that someone hadn't done it. I think that's probably his greatest contribution for those of us. You could no longer say, well, they never do the thin line mustache or the 5 o'clock shadow on somebody, or the elaborate perm 80s hair because it's too much. It's like they did it. They did all of it. They did the wrinkles on people's clothing, you know, all that stuff. It again, when you look at it in that sense, from a tactile perspective, compare it to the greatest stuff of the era, like the Batman animated series. X-Men is more articulated from a tactile standpoint. It's got more textures in it. And you know, listen, animators at the time, you know, they that was flesh and blood, man. That was hours, you know, of some poor soul doing that, because you just, you know, the computer technology just wasn't, the software technology wasn't what it is today, or even what it was 25 years ago or 20 years ago.
That was awesome to hear, because I know very little about animation. That was really, really great to hear. And I don't know if you all have anything to add.
So mine is a lot simpler, a lot shorter. About 10, 12 years ago, whenever MySpace was still a thing, we did a show with Chris Kattan called Canine Theater, which I don't know if it's available at all now. I don't even know if there's a MySpace now. But we would do animated sequences to intro the skits, and then they would do kind of comedy skits with dogs and voice the dogs. And one of the skits that we did was the X-Men cartoon. And we had to animate using collaged dog pictures, basically, and then, you know, move the different mouth around and the different parts and try to recreate in a funny way that opening theme. And then Catan and the other people would then voice real dogs as the X-Men and do a little skit on that. And so that was me looking closely at that. I mean, we didn't match it perfectly, and we're not hand drawing anything, but we had to watch it over and over again and try to make it, you know, as close, like what really worked in there. And there's a lot that works in that opening sequence. It really kind of gave me a new admiration for what they had pulled off in that.
Well, first of all, I think I speak for everybody. I say, oh my God, I need to see that.
MySpace is a real site anymore. If you go to MySpace and it tries to sell you like extends pills, I'm sorry. You know,
MySpace is real, and I have no idea. It still exists, but I have no idea how it functions anymore. There's like musicians. I don't.
Yeah, it's
I'm
mostly
too.
musicians, right? It's mostly people premiering music on there now.
I think so. I don't know. I ventured there once to try to, out of morbid curiosity, to find my old profile, and I didn't. Thankfully, I'm just gonna say that.
What would you say to your MySpace self if you found yourself?
Oh my God, I can't even imagine. I don't even know what's on that anymore.
Oh man.
I would say stop being emo. That's about the best I can say.
Everybody's sort of, you know, yeah. There is no scene.
What year that was?
I can't really think of too much creatively that the animated cartoon had on me. But I do know that I started writing around the same time I started watching that show. And that was also when I started getting into comics, oddly separately, but at the same time. And those concepts did greatly influence how I write. It's always these grand stories that I can't write a short story if my life depended on it. And it's always people with superpowers I can't write if less there's magic or superpowers or something. And I think my history with comics has something to do with it. And these grand stories of the animated series probably had something to do with why I can't write a short contained story, because those didn't really exist too much in the animated series. There's always this sense of it's building towards something epic or it's recovering from something epic, which is unfortunately how I write. So I think it may have had some influence on that with me.
I think for me, it was in terms of creativity and influence in that regard, it's kind of neither here nor there, but it did bolster my early fandom of X-Men. Like we were talking about earlier, that perfect storm of comics and toys and animation in the early 90s that just created the X-Men stamp on pop culture. And I just was the perfect right age to get sucked right into that and become an X-Men fan for life. And yeah, the animated series, absolutely part of that. Key critical component, and I'm positive that I'm not alone.
So before I read mine, Asta leave a comment about that it's great to know how groundbreaking 90s X-Men was for animation. Like the insight you gave, Sandy, is really great. It was also great for me. I didn't know all those technical details, and it's great to know that. And as for me and my influence, kind of piggybacking on things you all have said before when we were not asking this question, I think one of the things that really has struck me and that has been kept with me is that you can talk of topics like AIDS, like class, like oppression, and do them with like some context that is accessible and that kids can watch. That's my main like takeaway for creative things I do. I want to speak of all these things, but I also don't want to make like work that is inaccessible or that only certain people can read and that only the clever people can understand. So I like that it's there. It's at that point that where it talks about those issues. And well, it's not perfect or anything, but I like that. That's my main takeaway. And I think that's something that it has in common sometimes with the comics and sometimes not. Sometimes comics can be more obscure, can be more difficult to get into these topics. And maybe because it's 20 minutes of a cartoons, but it always was accessible by design, no matter the topic. So that was my takeaway. And I think we covered all the topics of the day. It was a great surprise, so thank you, Sandy, so much for coming and for the insight on the animation thing. I'm gonna save that somewhere because it's great technical detail. And for all the insight you all have plugged onto the animated series, I think we're gonna talk about this more in the future. That's something that definitely is gonna happen, and maybe this is some certain story or something, because there's a lot to unpack there. And thank you for the people that came and left comments because there were a lot of comments, and that's great. That makes great making the show. And so thank you all. If anyone wants to say anything.
Thanks for having me. You guys are awesome.
So one thing I do want to point out, I don't think we've announced it on one of our shows, Duna, but next week, Duna and I have been invited to an X-Men podcast gala. So keep an eye on Mutant Watch. We'll be posting how to watch us next Saturday at this grand event for a whole bunch of X-Men podcast people.
Yeah, that's gonna be great.
On Hellfire Gala level dress.
Oh, we're working on that.
Okay.
I'm not sure
What do you think's behind the hair here?
Yeah.
I'm not gonna be as invested as Gabriel, but someone has to be the butts. So, and 2 weeks from now, we're gonna have Sandy again and Kat on New Mutants, and that's gonna be great on these old books that we love so much. So thank you everyone for watching.